Hello and welcome to Podcastodon. I'm Drew Morgan.
And I'm Alex Ronquist.
And today we're ripping off 99% Invisible, and we're talking about card games.
Yeah, so the original genesis of this idea was I was reading up on systems design, and I came across something called Gall's Law, which states a complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. A complex system designed from scratch never works and cannot be patched up to make it work. You have to start over with a working simple system. So I read that, and then I thought about Yu-Gi-Oh! First of all, who is John Gall? I promise this will not be as long as the answer to who is John Galt.
You can get it on a yoga bag now. Apparently the overlap between objectivists and New Age types and semi-affluent soccer moms is surprisingly high. I guess the intersection is libertarianism.
I think they talked about this in hypernormalization, but do you remember the Californian ideology?
The thing about the pursuit of self-perfection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It relates to that. A pursuit of money as pursuit of self-perfection. And also a way to feel like you're something more than a soccer mom, which is deeply, deeply uncool.
Oh, yeah. And you know what the overlap between all three of those things is as well?
Being deeply uncool.
Wine.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like objectivists probably also drink a lot of wine. Actually, that's not true. Some objectivists drink Mountain Dew.
They drink Mountain Dew and eat Doritos.
Yeah, they do the do.
Anyway, John Gall is an American author who basically did a bunch of studies on how systems fail.
Worthy endeavor.
The conclusion that he reached was basically to design a good working system, you have to start with a simple system and build up the thing that you want from that, solving problems as they arise, rather than starting with a complex system, because you can't account for every problem, right? You're inevitably going to run into new problems as you're working on something.
Oh, it's like why the Soviet economy had to partially privatize, because a planned economy is inherently too complex a system to run.
Well, I think Gall's Law would be an argument for not creating a completely planned economy from scratch.
Yeah.
It would be an argument for starting with a simple system that exists in addition to the old one.
This is how we shift to syndicalism.
Syndicalist fist bump?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because that is made out of a series of smaller, simple systems.
Yeah, so we'll get back to that. Card games. We have to go in a brief tangent about the history of CCGs.
I've been watching a documentary series about Magic the Gathering.
So you may have some useful insights here. But basically, flashback to 1997. I think the Beanie Baby bubble had just happened, or was happening around this time. The comic book bubble as well.
A lot of these guys were comic readers.
The overlap for that audience is very large. Like, if you go into any game store that sells Magic cards, a lot of them also sell comics.
And I have background for this courtesy of SF Debris. After the bottom dropped out of the comic book market, the very few comic stores that survived basically did so by selling Magic cards.
Yeah. Point is, the creators of Magic had seen a bunch of bubbles around that time. They knew that this thing could really be just a flash in the pan, a trend. So they had to think very carefully about if they were going to make this thing into a full-on sustainable business instead of just a flash in the pan trend, how would they go about it? A lot of people give Magic shit for certain choices in its design, but given the fact that nobody knew how to do this and it could have all very easily imploded, I think they did pretty well. Basically, they were like, we want to make a trading card game. You know, you can build your deck and you bring your deck to the game and you face off against somebody else with their own completely customized deck.
Apparently trading was not one of the planned behaviors of early Magic.
Really?
They may have thought about it, but they didn't realize the effect it would have making it way easier to get rares.
Yeah. One thing that Magic players complain about a lot is the perception that Wizards of the Coast underestimates the average player power level. Like, they underestimate how many cards players are willing to buy and how much time players are willing to devote to the game. I think that the people making that criticism might be missing something, and we'll get to that in a minute. I'm not saying they're wrong, but I think there's more to it than that. We'll get back to that.
I'd like to introduce one other component to this from that documentary I watched, the SFW video.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out the Pro Tour was one of the main efforts they put into Magic's longevity.
Yeah.
Because they felt that all of the longest lasting games had a competitive scene that would give players something to aspire to.
Yeah.
And to formalize it as a single unified community.
Let's pause the Pro Tour thing for a second, though, because I want to talk about what happened just after Magic came out. After Magic came out and after it started to pick up in popularity, a lot of other companies saw its success and saw that people liked it and it was cool, so they wanted to try to do the same thing that Magic did. So a lot of new CCGs came out around that time, or like the mainstream licensed ones like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, and then you had like more like niche licensed ones like Netrunner and Legend of the Five Rings.
Was Netrunner licensed?
Oh shoot, no, Netrunner wasn't licensed, you're right. Netrunner's complicated because the old one wasn't licensed, but then they remade the game as a spin-off of the Android universe because Fantasy Flight made the remake, and Fantasy Flight also owned the rights to Android, which is also a cyberpunk thing, so...
Legend of the Five Rings is also originally a card game.
Really? Yeah, no, you're right. The card game did come first, didn't it? Legend of the Five Rings is an interesting one. The point is, back then, everybody and their mother wanted to make a CCG. And the companies were just putting out CCGs left and right. And almost none of those 90s CCGs have survived. Netrunner kind of had a second shot at life through Fantasy Flight, and then it died again. Legend of the Five Rings intentionally died because it was never supposed to... Sorry?
Then it came back.
Wait, really?
There was like Legend of the Burning Sands or something.
Interesting.
Which was a sequel series.
Without going too deep into it, because the story of Legend of the Five Rings is its own very complicated thing.
And Fantasy Flight Games made a remake of that too.
Yeah, Legend of the Five Rings was only supposed to run for a limited amount of time because there was a story that evolved based on the results of tournaments. It was really interesting, and there's a Matt Colville video about it that I recommend watching. Yeah, Legend of the Five Rings is kind of a different beast.
An Oni of some kind.
Yeah, it's like some kind of Oni. There were also a lot of CCGs that didn't do very well back then and kind of died. I think there were a couple attempts at a Star Wars CCG that just didn't go well at all.
The Star Wars CCG was the second most popular CCG after Magic for a while.
Yeah, but then it kind of crashed and burned, didn't it?
Yeah, but it was one of the successful early CCGs.
There was a Star Wars one, and there was like...
We own a Doctor Who CCG.
There was a Doctor Who one. The Doctor Who one is crap. It was terrible.
Can confirm.
You can't even play it with the starter decks. Like, the starter sets that we got aren't enough cards to play the game. So, yeah, don't get that one. There was like one licensed off of Over the Edge.
Holy shit, Over the Edge. It's been a long time since I heard of that.
There was like, Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and basically every like big media property that you would expect. Just so many of these. And almost none of them survived. Like, I don't really hear about them to this day. And even after that time, like, people kept coming out with new CCGs. And they keep dying. It's really hard to make a CCG stick.
Remember Chaotic?
Yes, I remember Chaotic.
Chaotic stuck around for a while.
Chaotic stuck around for a while, but then it died.
They got sued.
Yeah, it never really got that big. It never really reached like a critical mass of players was part of the problem.
I remember people we know that we tried to get interested in it being upset about the fact that it called your life score energy.
But Hearthstone, interestingly, Hearthstone succeeded where so many other CCGs had failed. The reason I think Hearthstone succeeded, partially, it was because there was Blizzard marketing money behind it.
A veritable marketing blizzard.
Also, I think it succeeded for the same reason that Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! Succeeded, and the reason why all these other CCGs failed, was because it was simple. The thing that makes Gall's Law true for CCGs only really work if you have a critical mass of players. And in order to get that critical mass of players, to get people like excited about playing the game and like sharing strategies and well, not for Hearthstone doesn't have trading or anything, but like buying more cards and stuff. You have to make a game that like hits as wide an audience as possible. The reason why Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh and Hearthstone all worked so well is at the beginning they were very simple. And the other developers at the beginning of the CCG era sort of assumed that because Magic was the first one, it was like the low bar for complexity. Like everything after that had to be more complicated and more advanced. But in reality, it was the opposite. Magic was the high bar for complexity. One of the reasons it took off as well as it did is because Magic is pretty easy to learn.
I would like to raise some points right now.
Sure.
First, I remember distinctly that I was exposed to Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic was the only one I was able to learn. Not because Magic was simpler as far as I could tell, but its rules intuitively made sense to me.
Oh, yeah. That's another part of it.
They seemed based on logic. I still don't understand how creature cost works in Yu-Gi-Oh!
It doesn't. That's facetious. There is a system. The rules of Yu-Gi-Oh! Make sense, but they don't map intuitively onto anything that exists in reality or exists in well-known fantasy in the same way that Magic's rules do. I think that's a good point.
The other thing I'd like to point out, I think you're forgetting one key factor for Hearthstone. Hearthstone is a purely digital game, which I think gives it some advantages over a card game for longevity because it's occupying a different niche.
Yeah.
It's competing with other mobile games, not other card games.
Yeah, there's also that aspect. But I think an important factor in the success of all of these games is the fact that they're simple and easy to learn. Because, again, you need a critical mass of players for a CCG to continue to be successful for a long time. The easiest way to get that critical mass of players is to make a game that is very accessible and to market heavily. So, if complexity causes problems for CCGs, why do developers do it? Let's talk about what Yu-Gi-Oh! Turned into. I have played a decent amount of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Not competitive, but ranked Yu-Gi-Oh!
I have played a decent amount of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a phrase I was not prepared to hear today.
I have played a decent amount of ranked online Yu-Gi-Oh! So not competitive. I haven't played in tournaments, but I've played against like somewhat meta decks. I think the highest I ever got was Diamond. I'm not sure.
That could mean anything.
I think Diamond is the third highest ranking. But yeah, you're right. It doesn't mean very much. I think I am an above average Yu-Gi-Oh! Player.
Okay, I can work with that. You are an above average Yu-Gi-Oh! Player.
So partially because a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Players are kids and don't really understand how the game works. And I have the advantage of knowing somebody who is very good at the game, who kind of explained to me how to play, or how to play well.
This is you, David Serlin.
Yeah. So I have some experience with, like, the meta, is what I'm saying. So, to anybody who's familiar with what Yu-Gi-Oh! Is like now, it might seem a little strange to say that Yu-Gi-Oh! Was simple back in the day, but it was. You know, you can summon only one monster per turn. A lot of the cards had like one line of text on them. It was just like you could summon monsters, you could play spell and trap cards, and you can attack. And, like, the spiciest thing you could do was, like, fusion summon. It was really not that complicated at the beginning. You remember we played Yu-Gi-Oh! When we were kids, and that was what it was like.
I barely remember playing Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm not convinced I ever actually played Yu-Gi-Oh! I thought I just looked at the cards.
I'm pretty sure we played Yu-Gi-Oh! Because I have a distinct impression of, like, Maneater Bug having some, like, significant effect on our games. But, like, the spiciest thing that we did in those games was, like, flip summoning. Compare that to, like, modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, which has synchro summons, Xyz summons, link summons, pendulum. I'm forgetting other ones. There are probably other ones in addition to like fusion. Oh, rituals are a thing too, but there were rituals back then, but they weren't as...
The hell is pendulum?
This is actually a good example of how complicated Yu-Gi-Oh! Has gotten. Pendulum monsters are cards that you can play either as a monster or a spell. If you play them in your front row, they're a monster. If you play them in your the back row, they're a spell. once per turn, you can. I'm forgetting how this works. uh, Yu-Gi-Oh players are probably going to think to cringe at this, but once per turn, you can pendulum, which has an effect based on like which cards you have between other cards in your back row. So they have a red indicator on the left side of the card and a blue indicator on the right side of the card, and there's like a number there, and there's some kind of effect based on the numbers and which cards you have between the other cards that lets you maybe summon something from your back row to your front row. And they have different, like, multi-paragraph long effects based on which one of those they're in. And also, they all do things with spell counters, if I recall correctly. So, in addition to that mechanic, there's also this other mechanic of spell counters that get incremented whenever you play a spell, and you can remove spell counters to do stuff. And I am just going to send you an image of one of these cards, and we can link that in the description, just to get an idea of the level of nonsense we're talking about.
You know, it's a good explanation when it uses the phrase some kind of effect.
Yes, you can effect some kind of effect. This is Endymion, the Mighty Master of Magic.
I look at this and I do not want to play the game.
But see, the interesting thing is that this all kind of works. In the old CCGs, they would have these kinds of things with these cards with like this giant ass text, but the game didn't really work because they had designed all that for problems that they thought the game might have. Whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh, this has built up over decades, taking the original simple system and then slowly introducing more and more things to keep it interesting and to solve balance problems and stuff like that. So you can play decks like this and the game will still kind of work and be fun, provided that you understand how everything works, which is it's a big condition. My point is you can learn Yu-Gi-Oh given enough time and persistence.
And if you started playing Yu-Gi-Oh when you were young, the complexity will have built up as you aged.
Yes. And so, to people who started playing Yu-Gi-Oh at the beginning, this stuff all makes sense.
Wait, just a sec. That says it's from 1996 at the bottom.
No, that's the copyright on the game.
Okay.
It's always said 1996.
Okay, that I was worried for a sec, and I assume it's first edition printing, not first edition of Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yeah. Oh, you know what I fucking hate about Yu-Gi-Oh cards?
What, that they look like ass?
No, they don't have artist credits on them.
Oh, fuck.
Random tangent, but fuck that shit. Credit your artists.
Yeah, that's bad. And also the visual design is fucking terrible.
They haven't updated it since 1996.
The top half is brown and the bottom half is green.
Okay, the reason it is that is because it's a pendulum, so the brown indicates a monster card and the green indicates a spell card. So it's both a monster and a spell, so it has that, but yeah.
Magic has this kind of thing, but the text boxes on this card are terrible. And also the art is overly busy.
We are saying things that every Yu-Gi-Oh player has heard and probably said a million times.
Including that the art is overly busy. It looks like Genzo Man.
Genzo Man's art is not this complicated. It is shiny in the way that Genzo Man's art is.
Of course, if Genzo Man had drawn this, the mighty master of magic Endymion would have enormous, almost bare tits.
Yes.
Because Genzo Man, as far as I can tell, is just wants to draw porn.
Genzo Man is an incredibly horny person. But yes.
Fucking old school. I do want to say, while we're talking about flavor, Magic cards looked good even at the very beginning. I would argue that they used to look better than they do now.
They looked good once they sort of cleaned up the original card. The very first card frames did not look good. They kind of cleaned up the design a bit, and it got better.
I think Magic card art and design in general just peaked with the Weatherlight Saga visually. Not game design.
Certainly not game design-wise. But visually, yes, I agree.
Oh, that's the other thing. I think Magic the Gathering, at least in the past, had both Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon beaten on having good meta plot.
Oh yeah, that was another thing. Is there was a lot of lore, and it was like somewhat compelling lore.
Like, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has, as far as I can tell, no lore.
Oh boy, Yu-Gi-Oh has a lot of lore. It just doesn't show up anywhere on the cards.
It's weird because the TV show is about playing Yu-Gi-Oh! With the monsters as monsters in the
Yeah,
card
no,
game.
but there's lore. There is lore to the cards that is apparently very complex. The fans have kind of pieced together from like hints on the cards and like random things, and it's apparently very interesting. I've just
How
never.
many cards have flavor text?
Only normal monsters have flavor text, which is not very many.
It feels like it would be hard to get lore with a game that had this little flavor text.
I don't know exactly what their sources for the lore are, but
When you said the lore was arcane and hard to understand, that was the first time you made me care about this. Okay, I'm being flippant there, but it piqued my interest. Anyway, I'm not interested in the Pokemon lore.
yeah.
The whole Pokemon League thing does not appeal to me.
Okay, no, Pokemon lore is very interesting to me for reasons that were not intended by the creators.
What, the whole ethics aspect?
And not so much that even, because it's like, yeah, they're putting these animals in tiny orbs that, it's cockfighting. That's like the most basic criticism of Pokemon ever.
That's the talking point I see all the time.
Yeah.
Along with what happened to Ash's dad. My favorite response to that is that
He's in the time zone.
maybe Ash's dad is Professor Oak.
Maybe.
Part of me just believes that Ash's mom is banging Professor Oak. I don't know why. I think it's some meme I unconsciously absorbed.
Anyway, so Pokemon lore is very interesting to me, not because of like the ethics aspects by themselves, but because of what the series does to kind of answer those criticisms. A disclaimer, I haven't played these games. I have seen long video essays about them that go into great detail.
Oh, so we're at peak
Yes,
bullshit
we're at
here.
peak
Fucking
peak
excellent.
bullshit.
This is good.
So Pokemon is a conservative utopia because it has these very deep-rooted, like, systemic problems. Their society is based around cockfighting. But the games basically do everything they can to make you not think about that. They don't answer the question. They don't either say, like, no, actually it's fine, and try to make an argument for why it's fine.
They may in one of the many games we have not played.
I'm getting there, because Pokemon Black and White kind of did a thing like this, but they don't really answer the question of, is this okay? They do something very weird, which parallels a lot of real-world rhetoric. So in Pokemon Black and White, basically, there's a gang whose name I can't remember, Team something or other, that is trying to free all the Pokemon. And they are presented as, like, assholes, basically, like, generically evil. And there's a guy who goes around and has, like, the ideology that a reasonable person would have. It's fucked up that our society is based around forcing animals to fight. And there's this guy named like N, I think his name is. I'm probably butchering this. I don't remember his name. I do slightly care about getting this right because I'm trying to make an argument here. Okay, so N is like a reasonable person and thinks that it's fucked up that they have a society based around forcing animals to fight. And N outlines his ideology to you at great length. And then it's later revealed, I think, that he was brainwashed by Team Plasma. Those were the bad guys. And that he's actually just like a pawn. They answer the question of, is this a problem, with the people who think it is a problem are bad people.
Yet they do bad things unrelated to their ideology.
They do bad things unrelated to this ideology. And then you're kind of supposed to think that the ideology is bad by, like, association with these bad people, when in reality they're not really making an argument that answers the question in any particular way. And it strikes me that this is really similar to both a lot of other stories, because it reminds me a lot of Legend of Korra, because all the Legend of Korra villains are like this. Almost all of them. The villain of Season 4 is not, but...
Wait, was the villain of Season 4...
The villain of Season 3 is Henry Rollins.
Okay.
The villains of Legend of Korra are V from V for Vendetta, Elder Spirit Guy, Henry Rollins, and Fascist Lady. You can tell which ones are the most memorable. All of those villains except Fascist Lady have a legitimate point. They have essentially good politics.
What was Elder Spirit Guy's point?
Basically, in the universe of Avatar, there is a spirit world, and society has become out of touch with the spirit world, and thus the spirits are attacking people. And he's like, this is a problem. We need to fix this. But then he also turns out to be I don't even remember what he was trying to do, but basically something that is unrelated. I don't remember season 2. It is definitely the least memorable season of Legend of Korra.
They do the same thing as Pokemon Black and White.
Yeah, or whichever Batman movie has Bane in it, which I also haven't seen. I have seen Legend of Korra, but I haven't seen any of the recent modern Batman movies.
Look, the version of Bane I know is the Oral Knots version who thinks he can rap and wants everybody to eat healthy.
I'm Bane! That's my name!
And that guy also has good points that are ignored because he's a bad person for unrelated reasons. I'm Bane, yes, that's my name. Bruce Wayne and the Batman are totally the same.
Oh, another thing like this that I have actually seen is Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which is a show that is fascinating because of how incredibly close it becomes to being good, and then just doesn't stick the landing at all. It's it really feels like it's setting up to do something really cool, and then just doesn't do it.
We've talked about this one before.
To cut the tangent short, it does the same thing, where, the antagonists are people who have a, completely reasonable point.
In this case, that the government needs to support the people who were resurrected
Yes.
by time travel.
Which I love, because it's a social problem that is completely unique to the Marvel Universe.
Yes, but the situation is remarkably similar to all those returning World War II refugees who discovered other people had taken their property.
My point is, it was a great choice of situation to have a political movement in the story about, because it's something that ties into the canon that already exists, but also, has parallels to real-world things. If they had just taken the story to its logical conclusion, where the heroes realize that these people are actually in the right, that would have been really cool. And they just didn't do that. They kind of did it, but they had these people do random generically evil shit, and this kind of character basically sends the message that trying to fix social problems is inherently linked to evil without making any logical argument for it. It's this kind of jazz hand that I find very interesting.
Pokemon has gotten totally out of control for something that started because a guy liked collecting bugs as a kid.
Yeah, I remember that story. He liked collecting bugs, so he decided to make a game about collecting bugs, and then it got really, really popular. Okay, so there is one last thing that I wanted to talk about, and this is kind of the reason that I wanted to do this episode, was because I was thinking about CCGs the other day, and I realized kind of that I've been thinking about and designing CCGs wrong. Because in real life, I have attempted to make a number of CCGs. I have various card game prototypes that I've done, and I find them interesting, an interesting design space to work in. And I realized the other day that I've been thinking about CCGs completely wrong. The reason why people play CCGs is not the reason why people think they play CCGs.
Oh ho!
CCGs are a magic trick.
A Magic the Gathering trick.
They are... The reason people play CCGs is for a sense of wonder.
Oh, it's like the metaphysicians of Clun. They're not after knowledge
Yes.
or an approximation of it, but instead a sense of wonder.
Yes. So, when you first start learning a CCG, and you see, there are all of these different cards and all of these different mechanics that you don't recognize, and, they have cool dragons and shit on them, and you can do all these things with, oh, I can combo these two cards together, and it makes this, more powerful effect, and it's really interesting. There's this sense of, limitless possibility, especially with a game that's been around for as long as Magic, right? There are so many Magic cards out there. You get the sense that you could make anything in this game. And that, I think, is really what makes people play CCGs. That's what gets people into CCGs and makes them try out different decks because they feel like, oh, I can do this. And
they do make truly wild stuff.
Yeah, they do produce truly wild things.
There was a deck that was just called the deck, and it was competitive.
Yes. It was, I think it was one of the first control decks. The reason why people play CCGs is for that sense of wonder. And the problem with that is that it's kind of inherently opposed to balance, because if there are very clear limits on what you can do, you don't really get that. You have all this huge range of possible things that you can do, but it's always kind of an illusion, because basically what tends to happen most of the time in CCGs is people will figure out what the best deck is. And once you figure out what the best deck is, the game stops being fun. Like, you play the best deck, and then you kind of get tired of it because there's a limit to how well you can learn the best deck. And some people don't even want to do that. Like, it's a different kind of skill than honing is a different skill from brewing. And so some people, when the best deck has been arrived at, don't even really want to play the game anymore. And so what you have to do when you're making a CCG is you have to constantly keep adding cards. You have to add more and more strategies to bring the game back into a state where people don't really know how it works, and it creates that sense of wonder again, where if you've done it right, the new cards will open up all sorts of new possibilities. But of course, you can never possibly test any of these new possibilities. Like, if the game really is as wide open as it seems, or what fighting game players would call loose, if it is as loose as it seems, you can't test all of this shit. So there are two ways to handle that problem. You can either design defensively, introducing mechanics and systems to prevent bad situations from happening. Like, say you don't want to ever have an infinite combo. Well, maybe there's just a maximum number of cards that a player can play on their turn ever. Or like a maximum number of effects that the player can play on their turn. That is something that you could do. Fighting games do this all the time. Like, Guilty Gear has combo scaling and stuff, so subsequent attacks deal less damage. The problem is that these kinds of mechanics in a tabletop game tend to introduce a lot of bookkeeping, and they introduce a lot of complexity. And as established before, complexity is bad in CCGs. Complexity kills the commercial viability of your game, because the more complex your game is, the harder it is for new players to get into. And so at least at the beginning, you can't do this defensive design kind of stuff. You have to at least let players figure out what the problems are. But also, you don't want to introduce so much complexity that that players fall off, because that's another thing that can happen. Even for experienced players, you can still make something that is too complex even for them, that they are not that they can't learn it, but that it stops being fun. You can still do that. So you want to keep complexity to a minimum. And so there's another way to deal with this problem of how do I make sure that this game with thousands upon thousands of cards in it is balanced, and that is that you just kind of ignore the problem. And you say, well, we can ban cards, we can introduce something in the next set that will fix the problem. We don't really care. Places in which balance matters aren't even really the point of a CCG. The point of a CCG is wonder.
What about competitive? What about the scene?
I think that that's where a lot of people get tripped up. Because if you recall, about the competitive scene being a strategy to increase the game's longevity and legitimacy. Because the competitive scene increases the game's legitimacy, people kind of think that the competitive scene is the core of the game. But that's not why the majority of players actually play the game. The majority of CCG players don't want to be competitive players. Not really. They play it because, again, for that the sense that anything is possible in this game. And that sense is an illusion. And people sort of think that you have to design for the competitive scene, and that is because the competitive scene is the core of the game. But in reality, it's the opposite. The competitive scene is an afterthought. Or at least what Wizards of the Coast has figured out is that they can have the competitive scene be kind of an afterthought and have the main core of the game be that average player, the person who walks into a game store and opens a bunch of packs.
It's about the people.
It's about the people. And the thing is, if you're designing for that person, a lot of these balance problems don't actually matter. As long as you keep introducing things that are both simple enough for these people to understand and like spark the imagination enough, and don't completely break the competitive scene, you can kind of drive the game like it's a stolen car, and it will still all work.
Remember to keep the power curve manageably flat.
Some amount of power creep is going to happen. Like, it's going to be required because in order for these things, new things that you introduce with every set, to be interesting, they have to be somewhat viable, right? So, and in fact, they probably have to be good. So you want to make them a little bit better than the previous set. Either that, or you want to do what Magic does, where you have set rotation. So that's why Yu-Gi-Oh! Has so much more power creep than Magic, is because they don't have set rotation. They have to make the new cards better in order to incentivize players switching to them over whatever the previous meta was.
I believe that rapid power creep is going to make your game more likely to turn into a bubble.
That is certainly a possibility. You can have that problem. I think that was part of what killed Chaotic. It's possible, I think, to manage power creep. I think that Konami has done that somewhat successfully. Successfully enough for people to keep playing Yu-Gi-Oh! I think that the people who criticize Wizards of the Coast for not balancing well may be kind of missing the point.
To be perfectly clear, we are not talking about any other criticisms of Wizards of the Coast, just balance.
Yes, the Wizards of the Coast has done a lot of other things wrong that definitely are very bad. But talking about balance specifically, like, I don't think it matters as much as people think it does. Because, like, the things that make a competitive scene good are not actually the reason why most people who play CCGs play them.
Can I use the metaphor now?
Sure.
The competitive scene is the NBA. Everything else is people playing basketball in their driveways.
Yeah.
I believe the basketball is about the pickup games between regular people in public locations.
Yeah. So I want to go back to the thing about wonder for a second, because I think that's really important. I think that this applies to other genres of games besides CCGs. So a good example is MMOs. People always talk about how great the old days of MMOs were. Like, at the beginning, where people sort of didn't really know how they worked, and they didn't know the range of what was possible. It felt like there was this whole, like, gigantic world that you could explore and immerse yourself in, and, again, anything was possible. And as people played MMOs more, they got better and better at them, and they got better and better at optimizing things until they realized that there was very much a best strategy to a lot of things, and that best strategy involved a lot of spreadsheets and a lot of like UI mods and visual clutter and like things just getting a lot more abstract. And somewhere along the way, the magic went away.
I do want to add, though, that a lot of stupid bullshit has been added to MMORPGs over time.
Yeah, there's another aspect to that, and that is there were a lot of convenience features added to MMOs to make it easier to actually play them, like to do the things that you want to do. Like, say you can transfer items to somebody. This is a made-up example. I don't play MMOs, so I don't know if this is an actual thing, but like... Or, like, you could chat with somebody who's not in the same area with you. Or chat or trade with somebody who's not in the same area with you, right? That makes sense from a game design perspective. From the perspective of removing user friction, it makes sense. From the perspective of creating the feeling of being in a fantasy world, it doesn't work because there's no reason in universe why you would be able to trade with somebody across continents. And sure, you could invent some kind of magic, some kind of fantasy justification for it, but that also it decreases, it makes the setting feel more gamey. It still has the hand of the author very cleanly visible, and it makes it feel less like you are in the world. Ultimately, it's not really a matter of designing games differently to preserve this sense of wonder. I think that the sense of wonder is just always going to fade. It's the natural consequence of interacting with a system long enough that you understand the boundaries of what is possible.
And yet people still play WoW.
People still play WoW, but it's a very different sort of thing than it was at the beginning. That's why people wanted Classic, but Classic can never bring back the original experience because people know more about the game now. And just the world and people's lives are different now. Can't bring back the original experience of playing that game in its original context.
You don't think people thought modern WoW had too much stuff in it? Like, there was some islands that they didn't want there.
I don't play WoW, so I can't really comment on that. But, this problem, I think, is not really unique to WoW. There's a broad trend, I think, of people becoming kind of disheartened with MMOs.
Yeah, but the shitty islands added in expansion packs are also a problem.
Yeah, but I think it's companies also do different things to keep their games interesting. Once people are kind of used to the game, the way that developers design things shifts. They're no longer designing the game to be like a fantasy world. They're designing it for the way that people actually play it. They're designing it to remove friction from the user experience.
I have a thing to add. If you want to talk about the kind of super slick, fast, addictive, tactically rich game that you always talk about wanting to make, I feel like trading card games are not the ideal platform.
Yeah. The fundamental problem here, right? You're attempting with a game like an MMO or a CCG to create a fantasy of anything being possible. This is always going to be illusory. It's a magic trick, and if it lasts long enough, people are going to figure it out and become tired of it. So, how do you solve that problem, right? There are a couple of ways. Number one is don't engage with the problem at all. You make a game that plays off of something else. And this is what Street Fighter is. In Street Fighter and other very finely honed fighting games, the appeal for the average player is the same as the appeal of the competitive scene. You gotta get good. And the process of learning and slowly honing your playstyle is the appeal of the game. It's also why people like chess, It is about just honing a skill rather than exploring a world. And that is a completely valid and good kind of game to make. I love games like that. They're great.
That's what got you into game design as far as I can tell.
That's what got me into game design. Reading David Sirlin's writing on game design, even though I now disagree with a lot of the things that Sirlin said, was what got me interested in game design in the first place, and also got me into fighting games. Those kinds of games don't tend to sell as well as the wonder-based games. Street Fighter does okay, but that's because Street Fighter has massive name brand recognition. Those kinds of games tend to have smaller communities just because learning skills is hard and people don't necessarily have the time to do it. They want to do other things take care of their kids or learn a different skill or watch Netflix or
watch all of those shows that I don't understand the appeal of.
Or, in my case, do game dev. That's the main reason that I don't play more fighting games, is partly because I'm burned out from work, and partly because I have a lot of other complicated stuff that I work on in my free time. Like the Podcastodon.
Thank you for listening.
There are inherent difficulties with those kinds of games as well. Then, the second way you can solve this problem is to accept that the game is going to end. And this is where we come back to Legend of the Five Rings. Because I think that the idea of a CCG that has a defined end time is kind of genius. Because it solves this problem where, like, when people figure the game out, that's when the game ends, which is a great idea, and lots of games work that way.
Also, if ever there was a game dedicated to maintaining the fantasy, it was Legend of the Five Rings.
Yeah.
It was really dedicated to the idea that you are a character in the world, and I admire it for that. Speaking of which, I was going to make my comment again about why I played Magic the Gathering and not Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh! Back when I played card games. Because Magic the Gathering was the one that actually captured the feeling that you were a wizard with an army at your command, or rather, you were a planeswalker with an arsenal of sorcery at your command. But no one wants to be a planeswalker until after they've played some Magic. Yu-Gi-Oh! Never made me feel like whatever it was Yu-Gi-Oh! Was supposed to be about.
Yeah.
And being a Pokemon trainer never seemed cool to me. Magic the Gathering is the one that felt most like a wizard fight.
Insert Weed Eater reference here.
Yeah, it just... Magic was the one where it felt like you were a character in the world. I think that pretty much covers it.
My point is, you can either
die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
Yeah, with wonder-based games, you can create a game that either ends too soon and players will remember fondly forever, or you can create a game that goes on forever and players get tired of.
The thing about Legend of the Five Rings is that I think it burned out in a flame of glory and honor and rock and roll.
Yeah.
But again, that might just be the mythology that has built up around it. But again, what other card game has a fucking mythology built up around its competitive scene?
I mean, Yu-Gi-Oh has some stories. Magic has some stories too, but Yu-Gi-Oh's stories are funnier.
That's the thing. I played Magic for a long time, and I never learned any of the great matchups of history.
Yeah.
I mean, I did learn about Channel Fireball, but that's not a matchup. I love the idea of Legend of the Five Rings, and I can love the idea.
Because it died before it could stop being an idea.
Rock and roll is here to stay. It's better to burn out than to fade away. Like Prussia, the only game that continues to add to its own mythology. By which I do not mean the lore. That's different. One of the things about this discussion that I've come to is that there's both an idealistic and a cynical interpretation of the concept of the sense of wonder. The cynical interpretation is that the competitive scene is a boondoggle. The card games that we play are never going to function as a proper game in the same way chess does, where it's about skill and mastery and stuff. And eventually, any card game will be solved unless you keep adding cards, which conveniently makes people buy more. The idealistic interpretation is that it has been and will always be about the people, not the pros, and that the battles that matter most are the ones that you fight on the kitchen table with your immediate friends, where you will probably never solve the game, so the experimentation and design is continuous.
Yeah. The one thing I will say about kitchen table Magic is that it is very much not for me, because inevitably somebody will come up with a better strategy than everybody else, and usually that person is me. And if you're the sort of person who has like a tendency toward optimization, and especially like a tendency toward playing to win, you end up just beating everybody else, and then you've kind of graduated your kitchen table scene and it's not good anymore.
We can also include game store Magic in there. I probably was not that competitively successful when I actually played Magic, but me now, coming up against you with a better strategy, I would devote some time and effort to finding a way to counter that.
A lot of people that I played Magic casually with are very sore losers, so... Yeah. Yeah. It's not for everyone.
Scrubs. They were scrubs. The way the system is supposed to work is many are called, few are chosen.
I didn't want to do that because it's so expensive to actually make a deck that can compete at that level. So.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the phrase many are called, few are chosen, because it applies to so many different systems. Alright, I've been Drew Morgan,
And I've been Alex Ronquist.
and this has been the Podcastodon. Fuck all million podcasts online. Thank you for listening to this one.
Thank you, and have a good night.